Well, Laurie doesn't really need much introduction from us. Laurie's trained many, many, many of the people on this call, either through Auburn or Columbia. She also does coaching and consulting around the church in other ways and has loaves and fishes now. And I went on the website and looked at that and was very interested in that training program. It looks great, Laurie. Um, Laurie is in Hudson River Presbytery, um, probably in a validated ministry, doing her coaching and consulting. And she is going to talk to us about post-traumatic growth. I discovered on Apple News some months ago this article that intrigued the heck out of me. We sent it out to you, all of you, but I was surprised to see Laurie's name on it, and I had to check, was that our Laurie? And it was. So we're really happy to have you, Laurie, and look forward to this. We'll go till about 5 after or so to give you a full hour.
All right. And that will really depend on the engagement and interest of everyone here. I'm delighted to see old friends and meet some new friends, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. So Lorna has said that there's a lot of interest in the topic, and so one of the things that I would be happy to know is if we could just very quickly, those of you who are willing to, just introduce yourself, just say your name, and what is it that you'd like to learn about? What is it that brings you to give your time today? Now just jump in and we'll try to get a sense of where the biggest interest is.
Can you unmute us all, Dana, to make that easy?
No, I can't. I can't unmute anybody. I can only mute you. You have to unmute yourselves.
If you're muted and you want to stay muted, just hold your space bar down while you're speaking. And when you let go of it, you will be muted again. And since I'm doing that already, I'll go ahead and respond. Laurie, I have a couple of clients who have been through trauma, and I'm not talking about COVID, but other traumas. And I struggle sometimes with how to help them because there's still so much grief work and all that they need to do. And I have, worked with them and encouraged them to seek professional, I'm not a therapist, help. But coaching them when they are so down and so struggling so much with just their self-worth is just a little difficult. So I would love to have your wisdom on that.
Thanks, Peggy. And feel free to use the chat box as well. So some of this goes in the chat. That's just fine too. If you'd prefer to do that, just put in there what your intention, interest is.
I'm a member of the Palliative Care Advisory Committee as part of IU Health Bloomington Hospital. I used to be on the palliative care team. And in fact, we just had a meeting of the advisory committee today, and a lot of, not a lot, but some grief and stress related to working with COVID patients. In fact, one of the nurses had talked about presented a case. It was a COVID case, and the stress that it put on the whole team. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to learn more about how I, as an advisory council member, can help with that, and also as a coach.
Okay, let's just take one or two more just to get a sense. Mitch, yeah?
Two sides of the same coin, and they're both COVID related. And one is our session recently tried to engage in strategic conversations about mission vision 3 years out. And the kickback was, we can't do that right now. We are having trouble having bandwidth to do 2 months out. We just can't address a year out, 2 years out. So that's one aspect, is just the lack of energy to be able to focus and to know where we're moving. And the other side of that is, if noticing the obituaries in the paper and the sheer number of obituaries that say a celebration of life will be offered when it's safe to do so. And we've missed an entire year of ritualizing grief and celebrating what needs to be celebrated. And eventually you get to where you can't catch up.
Right.
So how both of those seem to me really significant.
Absolutely. And Cindy talked about the different lens that trauma gives to clients and how do you work with them. So you all are raising such, and I'm sure those of you who haven't shared have some of this same experience, the incredible heaviness and difficulty of this time. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. I was asked to talk about how we move through or move into this time. So in terms of post-traumatic growth, so we're gonna do a little bit of that, but I want to be very sensitive to your own sense of what's important to you. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So, and Brian, thank you. Tools that help us think about the future in a new way. So that's really my biggest hope for this, that it is a framework that invites us to think possibility and positivity, which is one of the things we bring through coaching. So you all have already begun to name the fact that this has been an incredibly traumatic year in a variety of ways. And not only have things not been ritualized like funerals, let alone happy events, but there's a lot of literature that says we're going to have this sort of tsunami of mental health crisis as we begin to reopen and people begin to sort of process and experience what they've been through. I'm sort of agnostic about whether it's going to be exactly like that. I think about it a little differently. Nonetheless, as you know, there's a great deal of trauma that has happened and that people are carrying around with them. So I really want to start with a definition of trauma. Just reminding us that as we start today, there are 3 competencies that we're going to be really thinking about with our coaching. The first one is the coaching mindset, and we're going to take a few moments to really think about how we are experiencing and taking care of ourselves as coaches in the presence of trauma. So really that's the coaching mindset, the really being aware of what's going on for us. It's not just about what's out there in the world or with our clients or with our congregations. Evoking awareness is really the second competency that's going to be your own awareness and your client's awareness of some of what the possibility is. And then finally, the framework of post-traumatic growth as a sort of an understanding that may help in the facilitating of client growth. So in one way or another, we're going to touch into these 3 competencies. But we're going to start with this definition of trauma. So trauma is sort of broadly understood as the experience of a threat to safety because of an overwhelming event or series of events. It's a time when a person or community is isolated and at serious risk of harm or death. So it is that experience that a person can have, a community can have, a culture can have of this threat to safety, serious risk of harm and death, a sense of being overwhelmed. And the nervous system responds at that point. There's increased cortisol and norepinephrine that just really cascades through the body and creates that sort of fight or flight, constant sympathetic nervous system, heightened over all the time. And you all, I would imagine, have experienced that yourselves. I think that the beginning, a year ago, the first couple months of this, when we were constantly given basically terrifying advice all the time that if we were around somebody we loved, we could cause death to them or they could cause death to us. That, you know, singing in church could, you know, create a terrible cascade of events. I mean, it was a very frightening time and we were asked to be isolated. So there was both personally and collectively a sense of trauma, and our individual nervous systems, and then I think our collective nervous systems really had a reverberation from this that has gone on with the various iterations, not just of COVID, but certainly we then had the experience of the racial uprisings and the sort of reckoning with white supremacy and the violence against people of color and those communities. And, you know, that happened in May. And then all the political activity and upset that happened throughout the fall and into the early winter. So there's just been this sort of ongoing series of these overwhelming events. So we think about trauma in three ways. There's acute, there's chronic, and there's complex. Certainly acute is when you obviously just have one really bad event. Chronic is when there is a series of events and they don't seem to end. Again, that's going to have a different kind of impact on the nervous system, on the self, on the understanding. And then complex really has to do with, I think, trauma that overlays trauma that overlays trauma. And that has a lot to do with the way one can recover from it. Some of the literature has been pretty clear that some of the most difficulty with trauma is when folks have gotten themselves to, you know, sort of a more stable place in their lives, and then another trauma happens to them and it reactivates it all. So I'm going to ask you, Lorna, if you would also monitor the chat box, because it is hard for me to see that.
Let's have Peggy do that because she sees better than I do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Peggy, if you just keep an eye on the chat box. So if people have questions or, you know, just want to get a clarification or want to make a comment, please do put that in the chat box so that I'm not just sort of talking at you, but I can have a sense of your responses to this.
Sure, I can watch that.
Thank you. And I'm going to trust that you all will be able to use it. So I just mentioned collective trauma. And so I mentioned a lot of the pieces of collective trauma. I'm going to ask you all to just take a few moments here. And, you know, as you think about that coaching mindset competency and you know, one of the bullets under that is the development of an ongoing reflective practice to enhance one coaching. Just take a few moments. What has been the effect of the collective trauma on you and on your life? You know, how have you either felt it or experienced it or seen kind of effects from it? I'll ask you to just reflect on that for a few moments. And then I think those of you who might be willing to share something, I'm going to, would you be willing to put something in the chat box? Just just a few words about what has been for you some of the effect. A loss of balance. Yeah. Disorientation and erosion of basic trust. That disorientation is so, you know, you can feel it almost physically. How do I sort of get my grounding? How, you know, what do I start with? Yeah. Reflect on values and futility and changes. Thank you, Nydia. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's go inside and sort of recalibrate what's important. Lack of energy. Absolutely. And not remembering anything. Weary, irritable. Yep. We're really expressing both physical ways that this has had an effect on us, as well as emotional and psychological ways that we've been affected. And you can feel that it has all gotten woven in, and then we see it in our communities as well. The challenge to be real. Yeah. So
if you all can mute yourselves, that would be great. Thank you.
that's actually me. Unfortunately, Dana, that's me. Somebody's
Oh,
trying to
okay.
sell car-
Sorry,
somebody's
Laurie.
trying to sell me a car warranty. Sorry. So sitting in the ashes with everyone else, as Robin says, but then needing to go into cheerleader mode. So yeah, having to have those dual roles is very draining. Not knowing how to engage. Exactly. Where are we? So trauma is not something that's just affected the folks out there that we're caring for, but we are carrying it in our bodies, in our psyches, in our spirits. And there's a lot to recover from ourselves. So it's when we start to think about post-traumatic growth in general, we're thinking about it for our clients. It's also what's meaningful for us. How do we engage with this personally? One of my teachers has said that he has a sense that there has been almost an ongoing drip into the collective psyche of cortisol all the time, that sort of hormone that keeps us jacked up in a sense of almost hypervigilance about what we're paying attention to and what's going to happen next, and how do we respond. So there's been that collective trauma. So literature tells us that there are basically 3 responses to trauma. The reality is that most people are resilient in the face of trauma, and they return to normal, or what I prefer to call familiar functioning, after a few weeks or months. So some of that irritability goes down. Some of our energy comes back. We're able to remember some things. We start to kind of get our orientation back. The resilience returns. It's been hard to remember that because this has gone on for so long and has had such a up and down way of occurring in our lives. But the reality is most people are resilient. Some people have severe reactions. And again, the literature indicates that those who are having a more severe reaction to the trauma of COVID are often people who have had some other traumas earlier in life, or they're getting other things that maybe were healed, but then get reactivated. And so that's where they may require mental health interventions. And then for some people, there is the possibility of post-traumatic growth. So, and we're going to hold these 2 ideas of resilience and post-traumatic growth and talk a little bit about the differences between them. So post-traumatic growth was a theory that was developed in the 1990s by 2 psychologists, Tedeschi and Calhoun. And one of the studies that where I want to start is the studies that they've done since then support that this idea of post-traumatic growth is a universal phenomenon across cultures, meaning this is not just a white Western upper middle class thing that happens, but across cultures, there can be this experience of post-traumatic growth. So it starts with a shock to the core belief system, right? So post-traumatic growth doesn't just happen if you have a distressing experience, but something deep and profound shocks you, shakes you, happens to you, and that sort of, to use Cindy's word, that disorientation, or that sort of way in which we are uncalibrated can lead to the possibility of transformation. So Tedeschi says it comes out of a seismic event, not just a distressing experience. It calls into question our core beliefs about the world, about life, about the self. And this started when he was working with people who were returning from active military. and military service, and they were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. But then some folks began to move in a completely different and unexpected direction. They weren't just maintaining, and they weren't just coming back to the way their life was. There was a complete transformation that was coming out of working through these core beliefs. And so that growth potential comes not from the event itself happening, but the struggle to make meaning from it. So it's that struggle to make meaning. So Mitch, I'm going to go back to you, and I'm going to go back to that question about, you know, a community that says we're not ready to think about a strategic plan for 3 to 5 years, but maybe what we most need and want to do is struggle with how are we making meaning from what happened to us that might inform what the future could look like. It's this work of meaning making. And really having to, you know, really have everything sort of turned upside down, that really creates that sense of we're, you know, there is no new normal. You know, we're not interested in a new normal. We're interested in being different, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take effort, and it's going to take having gone through something, you know, profoundly difficult together. So let me just see if there are questions or comments about that so far. Does this make sense to you? I don't think there's anything earth-shattering about it. I do think that it's interesting to get the language. And that's what I think, where I think we can help ourselves and our clients is when we expand our sense of language and our concepts, you know, our own internal scaffolding.
Laurie, this is Jean Beaver. I'm wondering, having listened to all this, how important it would be to explore, especially with a new client, how this current trauma has impacted the client before we delve into some of their other issues.
So Jean, so you're saying how important is it to kind of get the context for the client before you start working on other things?
Yes.
My sense is the context will emerge.
Okay.
And let me give a caveat to that. So I've had some new clients that come in, and I think there can be a sense almost of emotional override. Like, I don't really want this to have affected me, so I'm just going to talk about the way I want my life to be, and I'm going to pretend this doesn't matter, that this didn't really happen, or that I can keep. I've had this sense of layers, you know, where people on one layer just want to keep pushing forward. If I'm telling you, if I hear the phrase "move forward" one more time, we just want to move forward. We just want to move forward. We just want to move forward. Okay. And I think of that as kind of an emotional override from the reality that some things have happened. So I think if you're picking that override feeling up in your client, that's the point at where you might encourage some exploration of spreading out into the context. You know, so what's this been like for you? You know, wow, you know, we've all been through a lot. You know, how has this been an experience for you? On the other hand, some people really need to sort of get to some kind of feeling of structure and purpose, and they're just trying to find out what they can hold on to in order to just kind of, again, get that orientation back and get that sense of engagement back that we talked about before. And so it may be with those clients that as you work on those goals that they have, to just kind of get their feet on the ground and figure out what's next. You know, I lost my job, somebody I love died, you know, things happened. Then they're going to bring the context in as you go. So I'm just going to say, I think you and your wisdom as a coach will have a sense of how it best comes in.
That makes sense, Laurie. Thank you.
Laura, John is asking, can one's sense of meaning come down to meaninglessness?
Wow. So that's a pretty existential question.
What I'm saying is, if we're coaching somebody about the meaning of a particular traumatic event. And they, after really struggling with it and thinking about it, they say there is no meaning. It's
Right.
it's meaningless.
Well, I don't think it's our job to tell our clients that they have to find meaning in things. I think it's our job to be alongside as they begin to create a narrative that helps them. So I'm not suggesting that we go into any kind of coaching situation and saying, so I'm here to help you make meaning out of this. But I think as we listen, we can reflect back where, in fact, a client is connecting with something that feels purposeful to them. And it's also possible, I think for many people, the experience of being isolated was absolutely meaningless. I can't make something great out of this, right? For many people, it was just, I have to endure this. This is not, I can't, there's no great metaphor here. And so that's exactly where they are. So again, I think we want to, the key here is that kind of respect for our clients. And I want to be very clear that, there's always in all of us this tendency to want to say, wow, okay, here's the new shiny object, post-traumatic growth. How can I help my clients grow? The reality is they may not want to. That may not be their agenda. And again, if we're going to stay with evoking awareness, we have to stay with our own awareness that it's really hard to be with people as they struggle. And yet, if we really hold that coaching container and trust that they are creative, resourceful, and whole, to use the coactive coaching language, or the hidden wholeness, of Parker Palmer, that it is there and they will connect with it as they need to. Our job is to be present and hold that and hold our sense of possibility. It will start to emerge, and it may look different than they think. It may look different than what we think. So I want to say a little bit about the difference here between resilience and post-traumatic growth, because these are not interchangeable ideas. So resilience, as it's understood, comes from that French word "salir," to bounce back. And, resilience is, when there are those reserves of resilience, whether it's physical energy, emotional energy, spiritual energy, that we're able to sort of fill up our well, and we have that energy to go forward into engaging with life. Resilience is a great thing. And so helping our clients tap into the ways in which they are resilient, or where they want to really help build their resilience reserves, is a really important part of coaching. Post-traumatic growth is going through the emotional and mental and spiritual suffering and not going back to what's been normal or familiar or feeling re-engaged and re-energized. In fact, it's coming back changed. I was listening to a lecture last week where somebody said, if you really go through change, if you think about the caterpillar, they don't come out a higher grade caterpillar. They come out something totally different. And so it's this sense of, I think it was Nydia who was talking about values and beliefs. There are things, I'm not going to be who I was as a result of this. I'm hoping and praying that some of our congregations will come through and say, we're not going to be who we are. Our ministry is not going to be the same. I've learned from this. I've grown from this. I've had losses. I've had insights. And I want to live my life a little differently than I thought I was going to. I don't know how many experiences with clients you have had, but the number of folks who have come through this past year and said, I thought I was going to retire in 3 years or 4 years, but I'm getting my numbers together and I'm ready to go now. I'm starting to put this in place. That would, to me, would be, one of the, sort of more obvious ways in which I think people are thinking about their growth and their lives differently, but there are lots of different ways. And I'm going to invite us to think about that in a few minutes. I can also see there's another chat. Okay. So does that, let me just ask, does that make sense to you, that difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth? What would be your... Your sense of that? And that both are good. Again, we're going to come back to, it's not that, you know, the gold standard is post-traumatic growth, and, you know, kind of the second best, sloppy seconds, is resilience if you can get there. All of these are ways in which people are going to recover. And they are all useful and they're all important. And for me, the post-traumatic growth is simply sort of adding another category that doesn't have that same feeling or definition of the more usual one that we're thinking about, which is resilience. So Tedeschi, I just want to have a couple quotes from some things that he has said as he's been interviewed about the COVID-19 pandemic and what's been going on. He says, post-traumatic growth is, in his eyes, a natural tendency, that it's not an extraordinary thing. Not everybody does it, but it's also not extraordinary. And that when we're alongside, so in our coaching, we can watch for this and we can encourage it when we see it, which is not the same as pressuring people to achieve it. Right. So to watch for and to encourage where someone is starting to think about doing something, being different in their lives, because it's going to be challenging as things, quote unquote, start going back to opening up and things coming together. And there will be this force field of it. Let's do it the way we've always done it. And for those who really want to begin thinking about, you know, I don't want to do it the way I've always done it. And I'm starting to hear a fair amount of this from clients. I feel edgy about getting back to the way things were because I've come to appreciate some parts of this. So again, how do we help watch for and encourage it? So post-traumatic growth framework has elements of narrative and existential aspects because trauma presents people with existential questions about what's important in life. And I think if we can slow down enough to sort of take this in and realize that part of our work alongside is helping with that narrative, with how am I telling the story of what happened? How do I want to tell that story? What do I, you know, as somebody said earlier, what do I want to take forward? What do I not need to take forward? And what have I learned about what's important in my life, in my family's life, in my community's life? The other thing that's always a little daunting here is that this traumatic growth cannot be rushed. And for most people, it can take a long time to come to fruition, where that, you know, complete sense of change, that, you know, that messy, suffering transformation of the chrysalis, you know, where everything goes to mush. It takes a while to knit itself back into something new. So the process is patient, and it may be planting seeds and holding possibility in that.
Laurie, John asked, doesn't resilience preclude PTG?
I don't know exactly what you mean by preclude, John.
Doesn't one have to have some sense of resilience to move toward post-traumatic growth?
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's going to be intention. I mean, I'm not sure, actually. I'm thinking about some clients that I have for whom this time has been, you know, profoundly destabilizing. And yet I would say that indeed what they are on the way towards, in being willing to stay with how destabilized they are moving towards some kind of growth, but I don't think they feel resilient at all. I think they feel oftentimes like they're just kind of hanging on and letting the spirit and letting life continue to work on them and staying engaged with that. But I don't think they feel particularly resilient. So I don't know.
We have another, I'm sorry, Laurie, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. Kristen, you want to say a little bit about that? Kristen?
Yeah,
Say-
I had to find my cursor. I there does seem to be some aspects that if there's trauma in a church life, and it's particularly going as in an interim, it's like
Mhm.
coaching an entire church. Where people will push back and not want to change, some who might see what the new is. I don't know. There were just some phrases you were using that seemed parallel to some of that.
Mhm. I think there is parallel here to our communal life as well as our individual lives. So as you think about coaching groups, coaching in congregations, coaching in judicatories, you can see that, again, there's no guarantee that coming out of trauma, a person or an organization is going to move towards either resilience or post-traumatic growth, right? Nothing is guaranteed, but it is that possibility of how do we, alongside as coaches, help hold the potential for that and help frame the narratives that might go, help them frame narratives that go in that direction, and keep asking these existential questions about what is it, what matters about this? What does it mean? Where do you want to be on the other side of it? Yeah, thanks. So Tadashi identified 5 areas where he has observed growth from trauma. Again, thinking that he began working with veterans, and there's been a lot of work in this area with cancer survivors as well. And then it's branched out in other directions, but those were really the 2 cohorts where the research began. So the first one is beginning to have a deepened appreciation of life. I do want to live, I do appreciate life in all its form. I've slowed down, I've let go of some things so I can really feel it. Relationships with others. I find that my relationships and relating to others has much more meaning to me than maybe some of the other things that I was doing before this happened. But those, relating to others, being in relationships has a whole new resonance to it. I discovered that I have more personal strength than I imagined I had. And I've heard this from clients as they've gone through the isolation, particularly those who, have really experienced the isolation profoundly. I've got more strength than I knew I had. So these are also things that I think you as coaches can help your clients, or just be aware of, to help your clients reflect on how you're hearing these things, recognizing new possibilities. I think that's some of what I'm hearing with some of the clients who want to go towards retirement now. There are new possibilities in my life that maybe I was putting off. And I don't want to put them off. There are things I can do. There are ways I want to volunteer. There are different ways I want to be involved, and I want to make those shifts. And spiritual change, the sense that I have more awareness of my spiritual life. I'm more aware of how central it can be, of how it can energize and inform and move me. So that spiritual change is also another thing that he saw over and over again with the folks he was working with as he was beginning to experience and conceptualize this idea of growth.
Mike is saying, this reminds me of Scrooge's growth in A Christmas Carol.
That is such a great comparison of yes. And he went through, his trauma, of course, was that terrible nightmare. But again, that existential question about his own life and what did it mean? So yeah, exactly. Very close to Scrooge. I bet there are other literary characters that we could think of as well that might speak to us in terms of how this sort of transformation can happen. Anybody think of anybody else? Let's see what comes to you.
There's the general arc of the hero's journey that they talk about. That that would fit with this as well.
So Mike, say a little bit about how you see that fitting with this.
Oh gosh.
Not trying to put you on the hot seat, but just to amplify it a little.
No, I mean, like with the journey, the hero's journey, I can't even remember the person that put it out there, but I mean, there's that journey, the loss of self that they have, then the coming back together and so on. I know I'm not explaining it very well, but I see you nodding your head. So.
Well, Joseph Campbell is the one that sort of popularized, particularly in that series he did for those of us who were that old with Bill Moyers. But also, you know, he was really reading out of the Greek myths, and you're right, it really begins with that sense of loss. So again, there are folks who are going to, that you're working with, who are not experiencing the same sense. We're not all experiencing the same sense of loss. Some folks are experiencing it profoundly and maybe surprised.
Everyone, but
I'm sorry. And some folks are really, you know, just a little de-energized and want to get, you know, get back to it. So it's going to be the way your clients, and as you think about yourselves, are coming back. Some of you are just, I was working with a client this morning. She's just ready to go. She's got spring energy. She's got a lot of ideas. She's ready to roll. You know, she's not at the point of a kind of post-traumatic growth where, you know, another client yesterday is really struggling and trying that loss of self, that loss of sense of identity, you know, that how do I find my ground? So again, you're going to encounter your clients in different places and in different ways.
Nydia says, what role emotions play on the movement from resilience to PTG?
So Nidhi, I think that, you know, you're going to watch the emotional, you know, the sort of emotional ups and downs of your clients. Again, I think they're different. I think resilience is, again, how do you, people who just want to regain their energetic strength, right? And move forward, if you will, or sort of get back to some familiar, maybe a little change, but some familiar functioning. I know who I am. I know what I want to be up to. I want to have the energy and the oomph and the direction to do that. I'd like everybody to join in. Whereas post-traumatic growth is, there's been a lot of suffering and a lot of loss. I've, you know, maybe I'm starting to kind of put myself together, but boy, I'm not going to look like Humpty Dumpty did at the beginning. You know, I'm going to come together with some differences, and some of these are going to be this emotional. I feel, you know, I feel this connection to people that maybe I didn't before. I feel, you know, more hopeful or less hopeful, and these values have really come to the fore. So again, helping your clients, you know, again, walking the landscape your client is in, to sort of get a sense of how they are managing this.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Laurie, I'll just mention one thing. I'm a cancer coach, and I didn't realize I was coaching people post-trauma under this heading.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say what you are, David. You're a what coach?
I'm a cancer coach.
Mm-hmm.
So I coach patients who have been diagnosed with cancer, and sometimes they're caregivers as well. And it's one of my favorite spaces in coaching. And I'll just say it succinctly. One woman who suffered breast cancer said it this way. She said, "I would never wish cancer on my worst enemy, but cancer has been one of the best things that has happened to me." So.
Thank you, David. That sort of sums up, I think, post-traumatic growth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To see that something that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy has actually been the gold, you know, to use, Dana had this metaphor early on, the gold that I've woven out of this, you know, terrible time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? So, you know, as I was thinking about being with you all, and as I was thinking about this for myself, sort of what is this role of coaching as we navigate this landscape, and the blessing for our clients of a companion to listen to the narrative and to accompany them, particularly those who are on a quest to make meaning out of the events, but also those who simply want to try to understand what's happened to them individually and also what's happened to us collectively. You hear over and over again the ways in which we are trying to tell this story and understand our role in it, and the possibility that we as coaches hold that there's growth and there's new life that comes from suffering and loss, which is, at the heart of our faith story. We are making that journey through Lent now. I mean, there couldn't be a more, I've heard from a number of people, I don't want to be in Lent this season because I've been in Lent for the past year. But there's that way in which we continue in faith, to trust that the Spirit is at work for transformation and for growth. And, as we can hold that in our own hearts and our own souls as we coach, we really enliven the field of our container of coaching for our clients to be able to experience that as well. So these are my little caveats about this coaching. As somebody, I think Peggy, you said this at the beginning, we're not therapists. We're not diagnosing that somebody has post-traumatic stress. We're not diagnosing trauma, but we are acknowledging that, woven into the experiences of this past year, there have been various, varied, and many layers of trauma for many people. And people are experiencing them at different levels in different ways, but it is a reality. So we're not diagnosing, but we can name it. I'm going to go back again because it's so hard to resist. There is no hierarchy of recovery paths. It's not better if one client really, you can see that they are really moving into some kind of real transformational growth. Another client is just kind of going on with business as usual and really, working on their resilience. We all want to recover and show up and be engaged in the way that's best for us. We hold possibility and potential and not expectation. You all know this. This is the hard work of coaching presence, right? And so transformation, and some of, to your point a few minutes ago, Nydia, I'm also experiencing that some of our clients are moving towards resilience because that's what's familiar to them. I want to get back the way I was going. I want to move forward. I mean, this is what's familiar, but what may be happening, what may be cooking underneath is in fact a transformation process that may emerge a year or two down the road when the person looks back and says, I got back to work. I got back to the way it was, but I realized it just doesn't feel like it did. And now I'm really thinking about change. So it may be that there are some folks who want to get back to what's familiar because that really helps them. And then down the road in a year or two, this transformation process that has begun cooking now will begin to emerge in some new ways. So those of you who are working with clients long-term, those of you who are working with congregations long-term, you may see this occur as well. And Tedeschi says there's a lot of room for that it doesn't necessarily, there can be a flight to health at the beginning of something when something that's been difficult is ended and we're like, okay, I'm ready to go. But that over time, we have that long, messy, zigzagging process. So, if you think about your clients, what can coaching offer that alongside? And finally, and Peggy, this goes back to where you started with, your intention. When do you know how to refer out? When do you get a sense that a person needs more mental health support and that would be, that might be alongside the coaching, but that you don't, it's not, the person has come to coaching, but there's a sense that this really is not the, most powerful modality for support for that person. So those would be my questions there. So questions, comments?
Touching just there on that, referring to know out or knowing when to refer out. I'm aware that a lot of counselors and therapists are overloaded, and some are trying. I don't know if this is necessarily accurate or not, but trying to, maybe there are some people that aren't necessarily, maybe they're trying to refer to coaches. Do you,
Yeah.
in some way, for people that are not quite as serious? I mean, I know that's a real kind of gray area, but could you speak to that?
And that may be, Mike, that there's a sense that some folks just need some support. They need to talk to somebody in order to just kind of get a sense of their life and kind of get a sense of direction, and not feel so isolated and not feel so discombobulated by everything. And that, that can certainly be a coaching thing. My sort of rule of thumb is if you get a sense that a person is really struggling with depression and or anxiety, which I think are the primary sort of flags that we're seeing with folks, and that they aren't, they really aren't getting any traction through the coaching conversations. They're just kind of staying in that same place. It may be a place where they need maybe they need a medication consult. Maybe they need, they certainly might need some kind of mental health professional consult. And to your earlier point, there is no question that right now that is very difficult. The lines are long and it's hard to do. So, we have to hold that tenderly as well. Yeah.
Laurie, John says one of the tasks of the coach is to move the client toward an accountable choice or action. How do we do that in PTG coaching without getting ahead of the client?
Well, again, I think there's that attunement. Like, so in our coaching, how do we stay attuned to where the client is and what the client needs? Again, I'm going to defer to your wisdom with your clients about what feels like it's most supportive for them, and what helps them get moving in the direction that they want to go. Again, they already are at choice, but I think it's very important, even as we hold that sense of possibility, not to get ahead of them, right? How do we stay in the moment rather than in our hopefulness for what could occur? We want to both hold that, but be with the client where they are. That's kind of the dance.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Other questions or comments?
Laurie, I'm a therapist. I'm not doing more clinical work, but it's very challenging, and it's a fine line, really, to draw the line. Especially if the client is sharing with you anxiety due to whatever, being in the house or dealing with losses.
Mm-hmm.
My rule of thumb is that when I'm digging too much, I'm going to become clinical.
Uh-huh. Nice.
Because I'm digging. So, and I'm going to go back to the past, and I don't want to do that because clients are bringing, like you said earlier, they're bringing past experience that this thing that they're experiencing now is triggering those past experiences. So if I go and start digging, that's dangerous for me, because I said, no, that's really my line. I said, I don't want to be digging because then I'm going to jump into clinical. So
that's a great rule of thumb, Nydia, right? So that if we can stay with the present moving into the future, and if the client really needs to rework something from the past, that's much more of a therapeutic kind of role. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. So let me ask you how this, as you think about your clients and the people you've been working with, to what degree do you have a sense that you have some clients that you would sort of think about, wow, thinking about post-traumatic growth is helpful as I think about being alongside them. Resilience maybe is a little more helpful as I think about being beside them. How is that in your own mind as you're thinking about your clients?
what has occurred to me as that, we throw around the phrase that we believe our client to be creative and resourceful and whole, but this is probably a really, really good time to explore those with our clients to make sure that they understand that they have the creativity of the resourcefulness and the wholeness to work through this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that goes back, I think, Jean, to that. How do we help our clients see and experience the personal strengths that we see and experience in them? That can be a very encouraging experience. Yeah. Yeah. As I've outlined this, are you thinking of particular clients for whom that this sort of way of thinking about it is useful to you?
It's interesting. This is Peggy. As I'm thinking about, the majority of my clients are already starting to make that move. Mm-hmm. It may be that they are in a different place with their sense of how this year has been for them. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I've got the one client who I mentioned earlier who has had an extreme amount of trauma, but not related to COVID. But for the most part, I'm starting to see in the last probably month or two, my clients thinking toward the future and in a growth mindset, not in a just bouncing back, but a growth mindset of what the future is going to hold. So I think people do certainly have the potential for that, and I'm seeing it in my clients, and it's nothing I'm doing. It's just just listening to them, and this is what they're sharing with me.
Thank you, Peggy. Yeah, I've seen a lot of that too. Others of you?
Yeah, I retired from IU Health, Bloomington Hospital, about almost 7 years ago, and I still know a lot of critical care staff, and I mentioned palliative care staff. I've sent them business cards to see how many of them would be interested in something like this. I didn't call it post-traumatic growth coaching, but it'd be interesting to see how many of them return, or refer back to me.
And it may be that this post-traumatic growth is something that we notice more in the rear view mirror than we do looking forward. That we begin to look at how we have taken something that we weren't even quite sure we could go through, and as we're there, and and again, as coaches, as we go alongside, that language may not be necessary or helpful, but with your own observation of how a client is growing, you can help them then look backwards. David, I would assume that the person that you worked with, as she was going through breast cancer treatment, would not have said, I'm in post-traumatic growth. It's only really at the end, when she's gone through and really experienced it, that she can look back and see how it changed her and how she engaged with that experience for change. Yeah,
Laurie, this is Dana. We just have a couple of minutes left, and Lorna had asked if you might be able to suggest additional resources for learning about post-traumatic growth.
I'll tell you, I think the best thing to do is just Google it and look for Tedeschi's work. He's very readable and he's quoted a lot of places. And you can, I don't know of any books on it, but that would be a place where I would go. Great. So Dana and Lorna, I'll turn it back to you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today.